There is a specific smell to a ruined life. It isn't smoke or brimstone. It's spilled oat milk turning sour on a hardwood floor. It's the metallic tang of your own panic sweat. Declan built the foundry from nothing, curating every distressed brick and imported bean. He thought he was untouchable. Then he threw a pregnant, shivering Omega out into the freezing November sleet because he was bad for the aesthetic. It took exactly 6 hours for the internet to rip Declan's world apart. The espresso machine at the foundry was a custom Italian import-polished chrome and matte black, and it hissed like a dying lung. Declan loved that sound. He relied on it. It was the white noise that drowned out the pounding headache behind his eyes and the tight, anxious knot in his lower back. It was 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, the air outside heavy with freezing rain that slapped against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of roasted Ethiopian beans, expensive vanilla syrup, and the subtle curated pheromones of the city's elite. Rich alphas smelling of cedar and cold cash, sleek betas smelling of clean linen. Declan wiped the steam wand with a damp microfiber cloth, his movements sharp and mechanical. His own scent, usually a controlled, pleasant spiced amber, was spiked today with the sour ozone of stress. The rent was due in 4 days. The new supplier had raised prices by 15%. Liam, his only reliable barista, had called in sick. Declan was pulling shots, working the register and bussing tables single-handedly. His knuckles were burned. His patience was entirely gone. The brass bell above the heavy oak door chimed. A blast of freezing air cut through the warm, coffee-scented bubble of the cafe, bringing with it the smell of wet asphalt and something else, something distinct, sharp, and unpleasant. Declan didn't look up immediately. He tamped the grounds, locked the portafilter into the group head, and flipped the switch. Only then did he lift his eyes. The silence in the room hadn't happened all at once. It rippled outward from the door, a slow cessation of typing on MacBooks, a gradual dying of hushed conversations. Standing on the pristine, hand-laid hexagonal tiles was an Omega. He didn't belong here. It was written in the frayed hem of his oversized, soaking wet gray cardigan. It was evident in the scuffed, waterlogged canvas sneakers that squeaked obnoxiously with every hesitant step. But mostly, it was the smell. Omegas usually smelled sweet to Declan, like peach fuzz or spun sugar carefully masked by expensive suppressants. This Omega smelled like distress. It was a heavy, cloying scent of bruised apples and sour milk, the unmistakable biological marker of an Omega carrying a child. And he was heavily pregnant. The swell of his belly was low and tight, stretching the fabric of a faded graphic tee that offered absolutely no warmth. The Omega, he couldn't have been older than 22, had one hand splayed protectively over the curve of his stomach, his knuckles white. Water dripped from his shaggy, rain-plastered brown hair, pooling on Declan's clean floor. His face was pale, his lips carrying a faint bluish tint from the cold. He looked exhausted. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day at an office, but a deep bone-hollowing exhaustion. He was shivering so violently that the movement translated all the way down to his wet shoes. Declan felt a sudden irrational spike of anger. It wasn't malice, not at first. It was the ugly defensive instinct of a stressed business owner looking at a disruption. The foundry was a sanctuary for people paying $8 for a flat white. It was not a homeless shelter. It was not a waiting room. The Omega took another step. Squeak. An alpha in a tailored suit sitting by the window visibly recoiled, wrinkling his nose in disgust at the pungent wave of distressed Omega pheromones. Declan felt his jaw clench. He wiped his hands on his apron. Just buy something and leave? He thought a silent plea. Just get a drip coffee and get out. But the Omega wasn't moving toward the counter to order. He was looking at the plush leather armchair in the corner, the one stationed right next to the radiator. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, were fixed on it with a desperate kind of longing. He didn't want to buy anything. He just wanted to exist in Declan's space, for free, ruining the atmosphere, driving away the paying customers. Declan stepped out from behind the counter. The wood floor groaned slightly under his boots. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, carrying the natural physical authority of a dominant alpha. He didn't puff his chest out. He didn't need to. He just walked toward the Omega, his face set in a hard, uncompromising line. The Omega noticed him approaching and froze. The shivering seemed to intensify. He pulled his thin cardigan tighter around his shoulders, shrinking in on himself, instinctively turning his pregnant belly slightly away from the approaching alpha. "Can I help you?" Declan asked. His voice wasn't a yell. It was flat. Cold. The Omega swallowed hard. Up close, Declan could see the dark bruised circles under the boy's eyes, the way his jaw trembled. The smell of bruised apples and desperation was suffocating here, clashing violently with the aroma of roasted coffee. I just... The Omega's voice was a rough rasp, like he hadn't spoken in days. "It's cold. I just need to sit down for a minute, just until the rain stops." "This is a business," Declan said, keeping his tone perfectly, even perfectly corporate. "Seats are for paying customers." The Omega's pale throat worked as he swallowed again. He fumbled with his other hand, reaching into the pocket of his soaked cardigan. I have... He pulled out a fistful of damp, lint-covered coins. Quarters. Dimes. A few pennies. "How much is... tea?" Declan looked at the coins. They wouldn't even cover a shot of espresso. He looked at the Omega. He looked at the puddle forming on the tiles. He looked at the patrons, watching them, watching him, the owner, to see how he would handle the vermin. Something ugly and exhausted snapped inside Declan's chest. "Put your money away," Declan said. The Omega blinked, a brief fragile flicker of hope sparking in his watery brown eyes. You'll let me... No." Declan stepped closer, deliberately invading the Omega's personal space. He let his own scent drop its polite filter. The spiced amber turned sharp, heavy, and authoritative, a clear biological command to submit to retreat. It was the kind of scent trick alphas used in boardrooms and bar fights. Using it on a pregnant Omega was a massive overreaction, a cruel exertion of power, but Declan didn't care. He just wanted the problem gone. The effect was instantaneous. The Omega gasped, his knees actually buckling for a fraction of a second. His hand clamped harder over his stomach. A pathetic high-pitched whine scraped the back of his throat, completely involuntary, completely humiliating. "I'm not running a charity," Declan said, his voice dropping in volume but increasing in density. "You're dripping all over my floor. You're upsetting my customers. And you smell. Get out." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The Omega didn't argue. He didn't cry, not in the dramatic sobbing way people do in movies. His reaction was much worse. His face went entirely blank, a deadened mask of practiced humiliation. He was used to this. His trembling fingers lost their grip on the damp coins. They tumbled from his hand, hitting the floor with a series of sharp, bright clatters that sounded like gunshots in the quiet cafe. They rolled across the floor, a dime spinning near the boot of the alpha in the suit, a quarter disappearing under a nearby table. "I'm sorry," the Omega whispered. The spark in his eyes was dead. "I'm sorry. I'll pick them up." "Don't bother." Declan snapped, instantly regretting the outburst as soon as it left his mouth, but his pride refused to let him back down. "Just leave. Now." But the Omega was already dropping heavily to his knees. It was an awkward, painful movement. His heavy belly got in the way. He grunted softly, one hand pressing into the wet floor for balance, his cardigan dragging in the dirty puddle he had created as his free hand scrambled frantically after the rolling pennies. Declan stood over him. He watched the back of the Omega's neck, pale and vulnerable. He felt a sudden sickening jolt in his gut, a flash of pure, unadulterated self-loathing. "What are you doing?" a voice screamed in his head. "He's pregnant. He's a kid." But the alpha at the window scoffed, adjusting his cuffs. A pair of betas in the corner were whispering eyes darting in judgment. Declan was a prisoner of his own aesthetic, trapped by the persona he had cultivated. He couldn't be the soft-hearted fool who let a vagrant ruin the vibe. "I said leave them." Declan ordered, his voice harsh, trying to cover the sudden shake in it. The Omega flinched, as if struck. He snatched up the last dime, clutching the meager change to his chest. He pushed himself up, struggling against the weight of his pregnancy. He didn't look at Declan. He didn't look at anyone. He turned and shuffled toward the door. His wet shoes didn't squeak this time. They dragged. He pushed the heavy oak door open with his shoulder. The wind howled, blowing a sheet of icy rain into the entryway. The Omega stepped out into the storm. The door slammed shut behind him. The brass bell chimed merrily. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. The hiss of the espresso machine, now burning the milk Declan had left steaming, filled the void. Declan stood staring at the wet footprints leading to the door. His chest was tight. His hands felt numb. He forced himself to turn around, pasting on a tight professional smile that felt like cracked plastic on his face. "Sorry about that, folks," Declan announced to the room. "Can I get anyone a refill?" No one answered. The alpha by the window picked up his briefcase, threw a crisp $20 bill on the table, and walked out without a word. The betas in the corner suddenly found their laptop screens fascinating. Declan walked back behind the counter. He turned off the steam wand. The milk was scorched, ruined. He dumped it down the drain, watching the white liquid swirl into the dark metal grate. He told himself he had done the right thing. He was protecting his business. You couldn't save everyone. If you let one in, they'd all come. He repeated these platitudes in his head like a mantra, but they tasted like ash. The smell of bruised apples lingered in the air, clinging to the expensive wood paneling, refusing to be masked by the coffee. In the back corner of the cafe, a young man with a beanie pulled low over his ears quietly pressed "Stop recording" on his phone. He didn't look at Declan. He just grabbed his coat, slipped out the side door, and walked into the rain. By 6 p.m., the rain had turned into a steady, freezing drizzle. The foundry was normally packed with the after-work crowd people, unwinding with espresso martinis and artisanal pastries. Tonight it was empty. Declan was wiping down the counter for the 5th time, rubbing a single spot near the register, until the wood polish squeaked. His phone, resting by the cash drawer, vibrated. He ignored it. It had been vibrating intermittently for the last hour. Probably Liam finally waking up to apologize for missing his shift. It buzzed again. And again. A sustained, angry trill. Declan sighed, tossing the rag aside, and picked it up. He swiped down his notification bar. He didn't see texts from Liam. He saw a wall of notifications from the local Bean, a popular neighborhood app, and Twitter, and Instagram. At CoffeeSnob88 tagged you in a video. At Omega Rights Watch mentioned you in a post. You have 47 new 1-star reviews on Yelp. Declan's thumb hovered over the screen. A cold, creeping numbness started at the base of his skull and dragged its icy claws down his spine. He tapped the Instagram notification. The video loaded instantly. It was shot from a low angle from a table in the back. The lighting made the cafe look stark, unforgiving. And there was Declan. His back was mostly to the camera, but his posture was unmistakable, imposing, aggressive. The audio was perfectly clear. "Put your money away. I'm not running a charity. You're dripping all over my floor. You're upsetting my customers. And you smell. Get out." Declan watched himself. He watched the way he loomed over the smaller man. He watched the pregnant Omega drop to his knees, struggling on the hard floor to pick up loose pennies. He watched himself bark at the boy to leave them. It looked so much worse from the outside. In his head, he had been maintaining order. On the screen, he was a monster. The scent of distress didn't translate through the screen, so there was no context for the sheer physical discomfort in the room. There was only a wealthy, healthy alpha bullying a pregnant, destitute Omega. Declan felt the bile rise in his throat. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly devoid of saliva. He scrolled down to the comments. "This makes me sick to my stomach. Look at how he hovers over him, alpha trash. The foundry. More like the trash can. Boycotting this place immediately." Did he really tell a pregnant Omega he smelled? What kind of vile animal does that? I know that Omega. He sleeps near the overpass on 4th. Someone needs to find him. The phone vibrated in his hand, a phone call taking over the screen. It was Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur was his primary investor, a silent partner who owned 30% of the foundry and provided the capital for the expensive Italian machines. Declan answered, his hand trembling slightly. Arthur. I don't want to hear it. Arthur's voice was quiet. It wasn't the roaring anger Declan expected. It was a deadly clinical disgust. I just saw the video. My PR firm sent it to me 10 minutes ago. It already has 80,000 views on TikTok, Declan. Arthur, it's taken out of context. He was pregnant and picking up pennies off your floor while you stood over him like a prison guard. Arthur cut in his tone, slicing through the air like a scalpel. My name is on the LLC. My wife is an Omega. Do you understand what you've done? I was protecting the store. He was driving customers away. Declan's voice pitched up panic, finally bleeding through his composed exterior. You don't have customers anymore, Arthur said. I'm pulling my equity. My lawyers will send you the paperwork in the morning. Change the locks, or don't. It won't matter. The line went dead. Declan stared at the screen. Call ended. He couldn't breathe. The air in the cafe suddenly felt entirely depleted of oxygen. He stumbled backward, his hips hitting the counter hard. The pain didn't register. His phone buzzed again. An email. Subject vendor agreement cancellation. Silver Creek Roasters. The beans. They were pulling his beans. He dropped the phone. It clattered against the wood, the screen cracking slightly in the corner. He needed air. He needed to move. He practically sprinted to the front door, grabbing the handle and yanking it open. The freezing night air hit him like a physical blow, shocking his system. He stood on the sidewalk, sucking in ragged, panicked breaths, the rain instantly soaking through his thin collared shirt. He looked left, then right. The street was empty. The street lamps cast long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. In the distance, an ambulance wailed. Declan looked down at the ground near the door. There, pressed into a crack in the pavement just outside the threshold of his ruined kingdom, was a single dull penny. The Omega must have dropped it on his way out. Declan fell to his knees on the wet concrete. The rain pounded against his back. He stared at the penny, the metallic tang of his own panic sweat mixing with the smell of wet asphalt. The realization didn't hit him like a train. It seeped into his bones like the damp cold. He hadn't just ruined his aesthetic. He hadn't just lost his business. He had destroyed his own humanity for a cup of coffee, and the world had watched him do it. And somewhere out there in the freezing dark, an Omega smelling of bruised apples was carrying a child shivering because Declan had locked the door. The interior of Declan's Audi was a masterclass in German engineering. It smelled of conditioned leather and new car synthetics maintained by a bi-weekly detailing service. The climate control was silent and efficient, blasting a perfect 72 degrees of dry heat against his soaked clothes. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles ached, the leather creaking under his thumbs. The dashboard clock read 7:14 p.m. 4 hours. It had only been 4 hours since the Omega had walked into his cafe. Declan drove recklessly, tires hydroplaning over deep puddles on the slick asphalt, the windshield wipers frantically swatting away the freezing rain. He left the gentrified sanctuary of the West End behind. The artisanal bakeries and boutique fitness studios blurred into pawn shops, boarded-up storefronts, and the harsh, flickering glare of halogen streetlights. He was hunting. But it wasn't some primal, noble alpha instinct driving him. It was sheer, suffocating panic. He needed to find the boy. He needed to undo the knot in his stomach to erase the image of the wet pennies clattering on his pristine floor. He needed to prove to himself more than the internet, more than Arthur, that he wasn't the monster in that video. The 4th Street overpass was a massive concrete artery that bled traffic out of the city. Beneath it was a different world entirely. Declan parked the Audi on a cracked sidewalk next to a chain-link fence. He didn't bother locking it. The engine ticked loudly in the cold as he stepped out into the dark. The rain couldn't directly hit the ground beneath the 8 lanes of highway, but the moisture hung in the air, a thick, freezing mist. It smelled of wet soot, stale urine, and rotting cardboard. The roar of the cars above was a constant, oppressive vibration in Declan's jaw. He pulled out his phone, his thumb slipping on the cracked screen, and turned on the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the dark, illuminating rusted shopping carts, shattered glass, and piles of discarded clothing fused to the mud. Hey, Declan called out. His voice was swallowed instantly by the concrete expanse. He sounded weak. He began to walk his $800 leather boots, sinking into a mixture of mud and unidentifiable grime. He hated this. His skin crawled with the urge to be clean, to go back to his loft and scrub himself raw under scalding water. But the memory of the Omega's deadened, humiliated eyes forced him forward. He swung the flashlight beam along the massive concrete pillars. Then he smelled it. It was faint, battling against the stench of exhaust and damp trash, but it was there. Bruised apples. Only now the scent had soured further. It smelled like cider left out in the sun to rot the biological marker of an Omega in severe physical distress. Declan's stomach lurched. He followed the scent, moving faster, slipping on a patch of wet moss and slamming his shoulder into a pillar. He ignored the sharp pain. Behind a concrete abutment hidden from the main road by a tarp strung up with bungee cords, he found it. A mattress pad, stained and waterlogged, lay on the dirt. A plastic milk crate served as a makeshift table. And there, sitting neatly on the edge of the crate, was a stack of coins. 3 quarters, 2 dimes, 6 pennies. Declan stared at them. The flashlight beam trembled in his hand. The boy had brought the money back here. He hadn't spent it on food. He hadn't spent it on warmth. He had carried his humiliation all the way back to this freezing hole in the ground and stacked it up. But the boy wasn't here. Declan dropped to his haunches, placing a hand on the damp mattress. It was cold. He had been here, but he had left. Where do you go when you have nothing? Declan thought panic rising in his throat like bile. Where do you go when you're freezing to death? He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe, forcing his alpha physiology to cut through the panic. He inhaled deeply through his nose, filtering out the garbage, the exhaust, the wet earth. He isolated the scent of the rotting apples. It drifted toward the east, toward the neon glow of a commercial strip a few blocks down. Declan stood up, his knees cracking. He jogged back to the street, leaving the Audi behind. He didn't want to lose the scent. He ran down the cracked pavement, his breath pluming in white clouds, his lungs burning from the icy air. He passed a dark liquor store, a closed check-cashing place, and then he saw it. Spin Cycle, a 24-hour coin laundry. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed with a sickly greenish-white intensity spilling out onto the wet sidewalk. The scent of bruised apples hit him like a physical wall the moment he opened the glass door. The laundromat was oppressively hot, smelling strongly of industrial bleach, hot lint, and cheap fabric softener. The heat was artificial and dry, a harsh contrast to the freezing damp outside. Declan stepped inside the door, swinging shut behind him. The place was mostly empty. A row of industrial dryers hummed loudly against the back wall. An elderly beta man was asleep in a plastic bucket chair near the front, a newspaper draped over his face. And in the very back corner, wedged in the narrow space between a vending machine and a vibrating washing machine, was the Omega. Declan's breath caught in his throat. The boy Finn Declan decided he needed a name, anything to humanize him in his own head. Though he didn't know his real name yet, was curled into a tight ball on the scuffed linoleum floor. The oversized gray cardigan was pulled down over his pregnant belly, offering no real protection from the hard ground. He wasn't shivering anymore. That was the first thing Declan noticed, and it terrified him. The cold had penetrated so deep that the boy's body had given up trying to generate heat. His skin was an ashen, translucent white, his lips carrying a distinct blue tinge. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and erratic. Declan took a step forward. His boot squeaked loudly on the linoleum. Finn's eyes snapped open. There was a split second of blank confusion before recognition set in. Then the reaction was explosive. Finn didn't scream. He scrambled backward, his wet canvas sneakers scrabbling frantically for purchase on the smooth floor. His back slammed hard into the metal grate of the vending machine. He pulled his knees up, wrapping his arms protectively around his stomach, his chest heaving. The scent in the room spiked a suffocating, acrid wave of pure, unfiltered terror. It hit Declan so hard it made his own eyes water. "Hey," Declan said. His voice cracked. He sounded completely stripped of his usual smooth baritone authority. "Hey, it's okay." Finn shook his head violently. He tried to press himself further into the corner as if he could melt through the wall. He couldn't speak. His jaw was locked tight, his teeth chattering in silent, violent spasms. Declan raised his hand slowly, palms out, showing he was unarmed. It was a stupid human gesture entirely inadequate for the situation. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, taking a slow, agonizingly careful step closer. "I swear to God I'm not going to hurt you." Finn let out a sharp, breathless gasp. But please?" The word was barely a whisper scraped raw from a dry throat. "I left the money. I didn't take anything, please." The words felt like a physical blow to Declan's ribs. The boy thought Declan had tracked him down over the spilled coins. He thought Declan was here to finish the humiliation to punish him for the crime of existing in his space. No, that's not..." Declan stopped. He didn't know how to explain. "I came because my business is ruined and my conscience is bleeding out." It all sounded selfish because it was. "You're freezing. You need to get off the floor." Declan took off his wool peacoat. It was heavy lined with silk, smelling faintly of his expensive amber cologne. He held it out. Finn flinched as if Declan had drawn a knife. He turned his face away, squeezing his eyes shut, bracing for a hit. Declan froze, holding the coat suspended in the air. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, mocking him. He realized then just how massive he was compared to the Omega, how broad his shoulders were, how his very presence was a threat. He deliberately crushed his own alpha scent, suppressing it, until it was nothing but the smell of wet clothes and sweat. He dropped to his knees. The hard floor bruised his kneecaps, but he welcomed the pain. It grounded him. "I'm sorry," Declan said. It was the first time in perhaps 5 years he had genuinely apologized to anyone. I was wrong. What I did. I'm sorry." Finn didn't open his eyes. He let out a low whimpering groan, but it wasn't a response to Declan's words. His hands suddenly clamped down hard on his swollen belly. His knuckles turned stark white. He curled inward, a sudden violent spasm racking his thin frame. The acrid smell of terror in the air suddenly shifted. It grew heavier, thicker. The scent of rotting apples spiked with something sharp, metallic, and distinctly biological. Declan's eyes widened. He looked down. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across the crotch of Finn's thin sweatpants, pooling on the cheap linoleum. It wasn't just water. It was tinged with a faint, terrifying pink. "Oh, God," Declan breathed. The stress, the freezing cold, the fear. Declan's own aggressive posturing at the cafe. It had pushed the Omega's fragile, exhausted body past its breaking point. He was going into labor. Early. On the floor of a filthy laundromat. No. Finn gasped, his eyes flying open wide and wild with panic. He looked down at the puddle, his breathing turning into shallow, hyperventilating pants. "It's too early. It's not time. Please, not yet." Declan abandoned all caution. He lunged forward, throwing the heavy wool coat over Finn's trembling shoulders. He reached out his large hands, gripping Finn's freezing, bony arms. "We're going to the hospital," Declan said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, but there was no alpha dominance in it, only raw human desperation. "Don't touch me!" Finn shrieked a sudden panicked surge of adrenaline, giving him the strength to shove at Declan's chest. "Don't touch me! You'll hurt it. You'll hurt my baby." "I am trying to help you," Declan yelled back, instantly regretting the volume. Finn recoiled, coughing violently. Declan forced himself to breathe. "Calm down. You are the problem. Fix it." "I have a car," Declan said, forcing his voice into a low, steady rhythm. "It's warm. It's 3 blocks away. I'll take you to the emergency room and then I will leave. I'll pay for whatever you need and you will never have to see my face again. But if you stay on this floor, you are both going to die." Finn stared at him. The boy's face was slick with cold sweat, his brown eyes blown wide, searching Declan's face for a lie. He was in agony. Another contraction hit him, and he bit down hard on his lower lip to stifle a scream. Blood welled up where his teeth broke the skin. He didn't nod. He didn't agree. He just stopped fighting. His head dropped back against the vending machine, his eyes fluttering shut. Declan didn't wait. He slid one arm under Finn's knees and the other behind his back. Lifting him was awkward and terrifying. Finn was impossibly light, all sharp angles and protruding ribs under the wet clothes, but the pregnancy threw off his center of gravity. As Declan stood up, Finn's elbow caught him hard under the jaw, a stray, uncoordinated movement. Declan tasted blood but ignored it. Finn let out a sharp, pained cry as his body shifted. His hands grabbed weakly at the lapels of Declan's shirt, twisting the wet fabric into fists. He buried his face into the hollow of Declan's shoulder, not out of seeking comfort, but to hide from the harsh lights. He was burning up. Despite the freezing skin on his arms, Finn's forehead felt like a furnace against Declan's neck. Infection, hypothermia, early labor. It was a catastrophic combination. Declan turned and kicked the glass door of the laundromat open with his heavy boot. The freezing rain hit them instantly. Declan hunched his shoulders, trying to shield the Omega with his own body as he started running down the street. The 3 blocks felt like a marathon. Declan's lungs burned. His arms ached from the awkward weight, and every time his boots hit the pavement, Finn let out a soft, tortured whimper that felt like a knife dragging down Declan's spine. "Almost there," Declan muttered mostly to himself. "Almost there, kid." He reached the Audi. He fumbled wildly with the handle yanking the passenger door open. The warm air from the still-running heater billowed out into the cold night. He deposited Finn as gently as he could into the pristine leather passenger seat. The Omega immediately curled onto his side, drawing his knees toward his chest, groaning as another contraction hit. The wet, bloody fabric of his pants stained the gray leather instantly. Declan slammed the door shut, ran around the front of the car, and threw himself into the driver's seat. He slammed the car into drive and hit the gas. The tires squealed against the wet pavement, fishtailing slightly before catching traction. As they sped down the empty avenue toward St. Jude's Memorial, Declan glanced at the passenger seat. Finn was hyperventilating, his eyes rolled back slightly, the heavy wool coat slipping off his shoulders. The smell of the luxurious leather was completely gone, replaced entirely by the scent of rotting apples, copper blood, and raw fear. Declan gripped the steering wheel, staring at the red taillights in the distance, knowing with absolute certainty that no matter what happened tonight, the man who owned the foundry was dead. The automatic doors of St. Jude's emergency room slid open with a sluggish mechanical hum that felt entirely too slow for the panic exploding in Declan's chest. He didn't yell for help. His throat was entirely closed up. He just carried Finn through the threshold, staggering slightly under the awkward weight, leaving a trail of muddy water and pink-tinged droplets on the pristine white linoleum. The triage nurse, a broad-shouldered beta in dark blue scrubs, looked up from her monitor. Her face went through 3 distinct expressions in the span of a single-second professional boredom shock and then a hard clinical grimness. "I need a gurney," she shouted, her voice cutting through the dull murmur of the waiting room. She didn't wait for a response, slamming a palm on a red button beneath her desk. Within seconds, the sterile air was violently displaced. 2 orderlies materialized from a swinging double door, pushing a metal stretcher that clattered aggressively against the floor. "Put him down," one of the orderlies commanded. Declan obeyed, but his arms felt locked, his muscles cramping from the freezing cold and adrenaline. As he lowered Finn onto the thin paper-covered mattress, Finn's fingers clamped weakly onto Declan's soaked shirt sleeve. The boy's eyes were squeezed shut, his head thrashing side to side, as another agonizing contraction rippled through his emaciated body. "Name," the triage nurse demanded, rolling a vitals card over. "Finn," Declan said. It sounded hollow. "Last name? I don't know." The nurse paused, looking up at Declan, really looking at him. She took in the ruined, expensive clothes, the bruised jaw, the sheer physical dominance of his alpha frame. Then she looked down at the malnourished, filthy, bleeding Omega convulsing on the gurney. The unspoken assumption hung in the air, heavy and toxic. She thought Declan had done this to him. She thought this was domestic violence. Declan didn't correct her. He couldn't. In a way that mattered, she was right. How far along is he? She asked, her tone dropping 10 degrees into absolute frost. She slapped a blood pressure cuff onto Finn's terribly thin bicep. I don't know, Declan repeated, his voice barely a rasp. He was on the street, in a laundromat. He's bleeding. Get him to Trauma 3. The nurse snapped at the orderlies. Page obstetrics. Tell Dr. Eris we have a placental abruption protocol. They didn't ask Declan to follow. They didn't even look at him again. The orderlies grabbed the gurney and shoved it through the swinging doors. Finn let out a high, thin wail as the wheels hit a bump, and then the doors swung shut, cutting off the sound. Declan was left standing in the middle of the brightly lit waiting area. The adrenaline that had fueled him for the last hour evaporated, leaving behind a sickening, hollow exhaustion. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling violently. Smeared across his palms and under his fingernails was a sticky, drying layer of Finn's blood. It smelled like rusted iron cutting through the hospital's overpowering scent of industrial bleach and iodine. People in the plastic waiting chairs were staring at him. Mothers holding sick children, older men clutching their chests. They looked at the blood on his clothes, the wild look in his eye, and they leaned away. Declan walked mechanically toward the restrooms. The men's room was blindingly white. He approached the sink, turned the faucet to hot, and shoved his hands under the stream. He grabbed the cheap pink soap from the dispenser and began to scrub. He scrubbed until his skin was bright red and stinging. He watched the water swirling down the stainless steel drain. It turned pink, then a darker, rusty red, then clear. It looked exactly like the scorched milk he had poured down the drain at the café. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. He gripped the edges of the sink, his knuckles white, and squeezed his eyes shut. His chest heaved. He waited for the tears, for the cathartic breakdown, but it didn't come. There was no relief here. There was only the harsh fluorescent buzzing, the smell of cheap soap, and the echoing realization that he could wash his hands 1,000 times, but he couldn't wash away what he was. He walked back out into the waiting room. He had told Finn he would leave. I will pay for whatever you need, and you will never have to see my face again. That was the promise. Leaving was the easy thing to do. He could call an Uber, go back to his luxury loft, drink himself into a stupor, and let the lawyers handle the wreckage of his life tomorrow. Declan walked toward the sliding exit doors. They sensors caught his movement and hissed open, letting in a blast of freezing, wet night air. He stood on the threshold. He looked out at the dark parking lot. Then he turned around, walked to a plastic chair in the far corner of the waiting room, sat down and buried his face in his hands. Dawn arrived not with sunlight, but with a gradual, bruised graying of the sky outside the high windows. Declan hadn't slept. His neck was locked in a painful spasm from the rigid plastic chair. His clothes had dried stiff-smelling sourly of panic sweat and rain. He was staring blankly at a muted daytime television screen when a pair of scuffed white clogs stopped in front of his boots. He looked up. A doctor in faded green scrubs was looking down at him. She looked as exhausted as Declan felt. Her ID badge read, Dr. Eris, Obstetrics. You brought the Omega in? She asked. Her voice was flat, carrying no warmth. Declan stood up abruptly, his knee popping loudly. Yes. Is he? He's alive, Dr. Eris said, crossing her arms over her clipboard. Barely. Severe hypothermia, malnutrition, and a partial placental abruption brought on by extreme physical stress. We had to perform an emergency C-section. Declan felt the air leave his lungs. The baby, a boy. Premature. Just barely 30 weeks. He's in the NICU on a ventilator. Eris said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Declan's face. The Omega Finny told us his name is Finn, is in recovery. He lost a lot of blood. We had to transfuse him twice. Declan swallowed the dry lump in his throat. Can I pay? Dr. Eris blinked. Excuse me, the bill, Declan said, reaching instinctively for a wallet that felt impossibly heavy in his pocket. He doesn't have insurance. I know how this works. I want to cover it. The surgery, the NICU, a private room, all of it. Eris stared at him for a long moment. The judgment in her eyes didn't lessen. It just shifted, becoming more complicated. The billing department is down the hall to the left. You'll need to set up a guarantor account. It won't be cheap. I don't care, Declan said. 10 minutes later, Declan stood at a plexiglass window. The billing clerk, a tired beta woman, ran his black card through the terminal. Declan knew what was happening back at his apartment. By now, Arthur's lawyers would have filed the injunctions. His business accounts were frozen. The PR nightmare was likely expanding, bleeding into his personal credit lines. The $50,000 deposit he was authorizing to St. Jude's was going to wipe out the remaining liquid cash he had to his name. The terminal beeped. Approved. He signed the digital pad with a shaky finger. He was officially broke. He had traded a meticulously curated empire for a piece of paper that said a homeless Omega wouldn't be thrown out onto the street. It was the worst business deal of his life, and he didn't regret a single cent. Room 412. The clerk slid a visitor pass under the glass. 4th floor. The hospital corridors were quieter up here. The frantic energy of the ER was replaced by a heavy, sedated calm. The smell of bruising apples was gone, completely eradicated by surgical antiseptics and heavy-duty suppressants. Declan stopped outside room 412. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was dim, illuminated only by the morning light struggling through the blinds and the glowing screens of a half-dozen medical monitors. In the center of the room, looking impossibly small amidst the wires and IV tubes, was Finn. He was awake. His head was turned toward the window, his profile stark and sharp against the pillows. The sickly blue tinge was gone from his lips, replaced by a terrifying, bloodless pallor. Declan took a step into the room. His boots squeaked on the linoleum. Finn flinched, a violent, full-body jerk. He whipped his head around his eyes, blowing wide. When he saw Declan, his monitors immediately started beeping faster, a frantic staccato rhythm tracking the sudden spike in his heart rate. Finn tried to push himself backward against the pillows, but his core muscles were sliced open. He let out a sharp, breathless gasp of pure agony, his hand flying to the heavy bandages over his stomach. "Don't move," Declan said quickly, raising his hand, staying near the door. "Please don't move. You're going to tear your stitches." Finn was panting, his chest heaving under the thin hospital gown. He looked at Declan with a mixture of raw terror and absolute, unadulterated hatred. It was a visceral look stripped of the numb compliance he had shown in the cafe. "Where is my baby?" Finn rasped. His throat was shredded from the breathing tube they had removed hours ago. "What did you do with him?" "Nothing," Declan said softly, taking care to keep his voice completely devoid of any alpha resonance. "He's in the NICU. He's on a ventilator, but the doctor said he's stable. He's safe." Finn stared at him, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He didn't relax. He didn't slump in relief. His eyes darted around the private room, taking in the expensive floral arrangement someone had mistakenly delivered, the plush visitor chair, the high-end monitors. Then his gaze snapped back to Declan. "You said you'd leave." The words were weak, but they hit Declan like a physical strike. "I know," Declan said. You said if I got in the car you'd leave me alone." Finn's voice trembled, a tear finally breaking loose and tracking through the dirt still smudged on his cheek. "Why are you here? What do you want from me? I don't have any money. I don't have anything you can take." Declan looked at the boy. He looked at the defensive posture, the absolute certainty that this alpha was only here to extract a price. Because in Finn's world, alphas didn't pay hospital bills for stray omegas out of the goodness of their hearts. There was always a transaction. There was always a debt. "I don't want anything from you," Declan said. His voice cracked. He felt a sudden profound exhaustion settle into his bones. "I paid the bill. You have this room for as long as you need it. The baby's care is covered." Finn's eyes narrowed, entirely cynical. Why, Declan could have lied. He could have spun a narrative of redemption, of a sudden awakening of his moral compass. He could have played the hero. But looking at the raw, damaged reality of the boy in the bed, the bullshit tasted foul on his tongue. "Because," Declan said, his voice dropping to a harsh, ugly whisper, I threw you out into the freezing rain for dropping change on my floor, and someone filmed it, and it ruined my life." Finn stopped panting. The room went entirely still, save for the rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor. "I lost my business." Declan continued staring at the scuffed toes of his boots because he couldn't bear to look at Finn's eyes. "My investors pulled out. I am currently trending online as the worst person in this city. I didn't come looking for you because I'm a good man, Finn. I came looking for you because I couldn't live with the silence in my own head." He finally looked up. Finn was staring at him. The terror had receded, slightly replaced by a cold, calculating disbelief. He was processing the confession, stripping away the alpha's tailored clothes to see the pathetic, ruined man underneath. "So," Finn whispered, his voice dripping with exhausted venom, "you bought me." "No," Declan said, his stomach twisting. "No, you paid for this room so you wouldn't feel like a monster," Finn interrupted. The tears were gone. His brown eyes were hard flat and older than his years. "You bought your conscience back." Declan opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. Because Finn was absolutely right. "Thank you for the room," Finn said, turning his head away, staring back out the window at the bleak morning sky. "Now get out." Declan didn't argue. He didn't try to explain himself again, and he didn't offer a hollow apology. He just knotted his jaw tight and backed out of room 412. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, severing the connection. He walked out of the hospital and into the freezing morning. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in bureaucratic dismantling. Arthur's lawyers were ruthless. They stripped Declan of his shares in the foundry, citing a morality clause buried deep in his operating agreement. They took the branding, the lease, and the custom Italian espresso machine. He wasn't allowed within 500 feet of the premises. The internet moved on, as it always does. The outrage cycle found a new target, a politician who said something stupid, an influencer who kicked a dog, but the damage to Declan's life was permanent. His name was toxic. His credit lines were frozen pending a massive civil lawsuit from a barista advocacy group he didn't even know existed. He sold the Audi to a used car lot in the suburbs for 60% of its value. He sold his vintage watch collection. He sold the designer furniture out of his loft right before the landlord slapped an eviction notice on his door. Every cent he liquidated went directly into a blind trust managed by the hospital's social worker, earmarked exclusively for Finn and the baby. Declan didn't do it because he was a martyr. He didn't do it to buy a ticket to heaven. He did it because every time he closed his eyes, he saw a puddle of pink-tinged water on a dirty linoleum floor. It was a selfish transaction, just like Finn had said. He was buying sleep. By mid-December, Declan was living in a damp ground-floor studio in the South Ward, where the radiator clanged like a pipe wrench against a skull, and the air always smelled faintly of boiling cabbage. He needed to eat. He needed to pay the $600 rent. So he got a job. Patsy's was a 24-hour diner that sat in the shadow of the interstate overpass, a mile away from the laundromat where Finn's water had broken. It was a place where truck drivers ate rubbery eggs at 3 a.m. and local drunks sobered up over black coffee. Declan, the man who had once lectured a food critic on the subtle tasting notes of single-origin beans, was now wearing a stained polyblend apron, pouring industrial sludge from a glass carafe into heavy chipped ceramic mugs. He smelled like old fryer grease and cheap bleach. His expensive amber cologne had run out 2 weeks ago, and he couldn't afford to replace it. His natural alpha scent, usually so commanding, was permanently suppressed, buried under the heavy exhaustion of double shifts and sheer humiliation. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Sleet was tapping aggressively against the diner's foggy front window. Declan was using a gray rag to aggressively scrub a patch of dried ketchup off the Formica counter. Hey, big guy." Brenda, the 50-year-old beta waitress who worked the day shift, barked from the pass-through window. "Order up, 2 lumberjack specials, side of extra grease." Declan grunted, tossing the rag into a plastic tub beneath the counter. He grabbed the heavy plates, the heat of the ceramic burning his calloused thumbs, and carried them to a booth in the back. He didn't make eye contact with the customers. He never did anymore. When he returned to the counter, the bell above the front door chimed. A blast of freezing wet air cut through the heavy smell of bacon fat. Declan grabbed his rag and wiped his hands, looking up mechanically to greet the customer. "Take a seat, any—" The words died in his throat. Standing on the cracked black and white checkered tiles of the diner entryway was Finn. He was wearing a thick, oversized navy blue parka. It was new, heavily insulated. Strapped to his chest in a secure ergonomic carrier was a bundle wrapped in a thick wool blanket. A tiny knitted hat with bear ears was just visible, peeking out from the top. Finn looked different. The hollow, bruised exhaustion was gone. He was still thin, but the terrifying ashen pallor had been replaced by the healthy flush tone of survival. He smelled completely different, too. The rotting apple scent of distress had vanished. He smelled like expensive baby powder sour milk and the clean, sharp ozone of the winter air. Declan froze behind the counter. The glass carafe of coffee in his hand trembled slightly. Finn didn't look terrified. He didn't flinch. He looked around the dingy, brightly lit diner with a critical eye, taking in the peeling vinyl booths and the sticky menus. Then his brown eyes locked onto Declan. He saw the stained apron. He saw the grease-slicked hair. He saw the dark, heavy bags under Declan's eyes. Finn walked slowly toward the counter. His boots sturdy, waterproof, and new thudded softly against the linoleum. He didn't squeak anymore. He stopped directly in front of Declan. The counter was a narrow barrier between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The diner hummed around them, the sizzling of the grill, the clatter of silverware, a truck downshifting on the highway outside. "The social worker gave me the keys to an apartment yesterday," Finn said. His voice was steady. It wasn't the raspy, terrified whisper from the laundromat. It was solid. "A 2-bedroom, ground floor. The lease is paid out for 2 years. Declan swallowed. His throat felt like sandpaper. "Good. That's good." She said the trust also covered the NICU bill, and there's a stipend for groceries. Finn continued, his eyes scanning Declan's face, searching for the catch. "She wouldn't tell me who funded it, said it was an anonymous donor." Declan looked down at the scratched formica. "It's a big city, lots of charities." "Yeah," Finn said. A dry, humorless huff of breath escaped his nose. "I went back to your cafe, just to see. There's paper over the windows. The sign is gone." Declan tightened his grip on the coffee carafe, his knuckles turning white. "I don't own it anymore." "I figured." Finn shifted his weight. The baby strapped to his chest let out a soft, wet snuffle, a tiny fist blindly rooting against Finn's collarbone. Finn's hand moved instinctively, cupping the back of the small head, his thumb gently stroking the knitted bear ears. The gesture was so casual, so profoundly protective, that it made Declan's chest ache with an emotion he couldn't name. Can I get you something?" Declan asked, his voice rough. He forced himself back into the role of the employee. It was safer here. "No," Finn said. Finn reached his free hand into the pocket of his parka. He pulled his fist out and held it over the counter. Declan's stomach dropped. He knew what was coming. Finn opened his hand. A handful of coins dropped onto the formica. Clack, clink. They didn't roll away this time. The surface was sticky with cheap syrup and age. 3 quarters, 2 dimes, 6 pennies. They sat in a neat, dull pile directly between them. "I owed you for the floor space," Finn said softly. Declan stared at the pile of change. It was exactly $1.01, the exact amount that had spilled on the polished tiles of the foundry 3 months ago. He slowly reached out his thick, grease-burned fingers, brushing against the cold metal. He didn't sweep them away. He just touched the edge of a quarter. "You didn't owe me anything," Declan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I owed you." "Yeah, you did." Finn agreed without hesitation. There was no softening of the blow. No, "It's okay." It wasn't okay. It would never be okay. Is he healthy?" Declan asked, his eyes flickering down to the bundle on Finn's chest. He didn't dare ask the baby's name. That was a privilege he hadn't earned. His lungs are still a little weak, Finn said, looking down at the sleeping infant. His hard expression fractured slightly, revealing a deep, bone-weary love. He has to use a nebulizer twice a day, but he's gaining weight. He's tough. He got that from you. Finn looked back up. He studied Declan for a long, uncomfortable minute. He was looking at the ruined alpha, the man who had been stripped of his power, his aesthetic, and his pride. I came here to hate you, Finn admitted, his voice remarkably calm. I asked the social worker where you went. I wanted to see you pouring cheap coffee. I wanted to see you miserable. I thought it would make me feel better. Declan let out a harsh, self-deprecating laugh. Did it? A little, Finn said honestly. But mostly it just smells really bad in here. Declan cracked a small, broken smile. It's the fryer oil. It gets into your pores. You never get it out. I used to smell like garbage and old adrenaline, Finn said, resting his hand protectively over his son. You get used to the dirt. You just have to decide if you're going to let it bury you. Declan looked at the Omega. Finn was 22 years old, a single father with a scarred abdomen and a traumatized nervous system, lecturing a 35-year-old former millionaire on resilience. And he was entirely right to do it. Are you going to be okay? Declan asked. It was a stupid, massive question. Finn looked at the coins on the counter. Then he looked at Declan's grease-stained apron. The rent is paid, Finn said simply. We have heat. He has formula. We'll survive. Finn took a step back from the counter. He adjusted the straps of the carrier on his shoulders. He didn't say thank you for the trust fund. He didn't forgive Declan for the café. They both knew the money didn't buy absolution. It just bought a level playing field. Don't lose the change this time, Finn said. He turned around and walked toward the door. The bell chimed brightly as he pushed it open. The freezing sleet swirled around him for a brief second before the door clicked shut, cutting off the draft. Declan stood alone behind the counter. The diner buzzed around him, entirely indifferent to the quiet transaction that had just occurred. He looked down at the sticky formica. He reached out and carefully swept the $1.01 into his palm. The metal was warm from the diner's artificial heat. He didn't put the money in the register. He slipped the coins into the deep front pocket of his apron. They sat there, a heavy, solid weight against his thigh. Hey, Declan, Brenda yelled from the back. Table 4 needs a wipe down and someone spilled milk in the aisle. Coming, Declan called back. He grabbed the gray rag from the plastic tub. It was damp and smelled heavily of bleach. He walked out from behind the counter, heading toward the mess. His boots squeaked slightly against the wet linoleum. He wasn't redeemed. He wasn't a hero. He was just a guy with burned knuckles working a shift, carrying the exact weight of his sins in his pocket. It wasn't a clean ending, but as he bent down to wipe up the spilled milk, he realized it was finally brutally real. Did Declan actually get what he deserved? Or did his money buy him an easy way out of a lifetime of guilt? Can a ruined alpha ever truly make amends to an omega he pushed to the brink of death? Or are some stains just impossible to wash away? Let us know what you think about Finn's final act of revenge in the comments below. If this raw, gritty Omegaverse story hit you right in the feels, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, unapologetic storytelling.